Excuse me, young man, but are you sure you're in the right terminal? The question cuts through the hushed atmosphere of Atlantic Airlines Premium Passenger Lounge like a blade through silk. Devon Carter, 11 years old with serious dark eyes and a navy blazer that fits him perfectly, looks up from his boarding pass to meet the skeptical gaze of gate agent Lisa Hendricks. "Yes, ma'am," Devon replies, with the kind of polite certainty that comes from careful instruction. Terminal A. Gate 12. First class to Chicago. Lisa's fingers hover over her keyboard, her smile tight and professional. Behind her, two other gate agents exchange glances that Devon pretends not to notice. At 11, he's learned to read the language of adult disapproval, the subtle shifts in tone that signal trouble ahead. "And you're traveling alone." Lisa continues, her voice carrying that particular brand of concern that isn't really concern at all. Devon produces a manila folder from his leather messenger bag, movements deliberate and practiced. "Yes, ma'am. Here's my unaccompanied minor documentation, government ID, and boarding pass." He spreads the papers across the counter like evidence in a trial he knows he's already been judged for. Lisa examines each document with the intensity of a forensic investigator, turning the boarding pass over twice, holding Devon's ID up to the light. Her colleague, Agent Rodriguez, leans over to peer at the papers. "James Carter," Rodriguez reads from the credit card receipt. "Platinum member. Card's been active for 8 years. He sounds surprised, as if longevity of membership should correlate with the cardholder looking a certain way. "Problem?" Devon asks, his voice steady despite the knot forming in his stomach. He's done this 17 times over the past 8 months, but it never gets easier. The stares, the questions, the assumption that his presence in first class must be some kind of mistake. "No problem," Lisa says, though her tone suggests otherwise. "Just standard verification for unaccompanied minors, especially in premium cabins." The emphasis on premium hangs in the air like an accusation. Devon checks his phone discreetly. A single text message waits at the office. "You know what to do. Stay strong, son. Dad." He types back quickly. "At gate now. They're checking everything twice." The response comes immediately. "Document everything. Trust the plan." Devon slips his phone back into his jacket pocket, where it rests next to a device that looks like a standard smartphone, but serves a very different purpose. His father's instructions echo in his mind. "Stay calm. Be respectful. Let them reveal exactly who they are." "All right, Mr. Carter," Lisa says, finally handing back his documents. "Everything appears to be in order. Boarding begins in 20 minutes. As Devon moves away from the counter, he catches Lisa's whispered comment to Rodriguez. "I don't know what kind of money that family has, but that kid's got more composure than most adults." "Maybe that's the problem," Rodriguez mutters back. Devon finds a seat near the windows overlooking the tarmac, where Atlantic Airlines Flight 447 sits gleaming in the afternoon sun. A Boeing 777 first-class cabin in the forward section, exactly where he'll be sitting in seat 2B. He opens his calculus textbook, genuine homework, not a prop, and begins working through differential equations while keeping his ears tuned to the conversations around him. "Look at that little gentleman," says an elderly woman to her husband. "Reading calculus at his age. Reminds me of my grandson." Her husband, a man in an expensive suit, glances over. Traveling alone in first class, though. Where are his parents? "Maybe they're already on board," the woman suggests, but her husband's expression suggests he doubts it. Devon continues working, letting the familiar rhythm of mathematics calm his nerves. This is what he does, what he's been doing for 8 months now. Flying routes across the country, documenting experiences, gathering evidence that will ultimately serve a purpose larger than himself. His phone buzzes with a text from an unknown number. This is Professor Helen Barnes, Seat 3A. I'm the retired teacher sitting 2 rows behind you. If you need any help boarding or during the flight, just let me know. Devon looks around and spots her, a black woman in her 70s, with kind eyes and silver hair pulled back in an elegant bun. She gives him a small, encouraging nod. Something in her expression suggests she's seen this before, knows what's coming. He types back, "Thank you, Professor Barnes. I appreciate your kindness." Another passenger catches his attention, a man in his 40s with a laptop bag slung over his shoulder and a phone that he keeps checking. Marcus Webb, according to his airline app notification that pops up briefly on his screen. Seat 1C. He's been watching the interaction at the gate counter with increasing interest, the way someone does when they recognize injustice brewing. First-class passengers, we're ready to begin pre-boarding, comes the announcement. We'll start with passengers requiring special assistance, followed by our platinum members and first-class passengers. Devon gathers his belongings, textbook, notebook, folder of documents, messenger bag, and joins the line. He notices Sarah Mitchell for the first time as she emerges from the jetway to oversee boarding. Tall, blonde, with the kind of smile that's been practiced in customer service training, but doesn't quite reach her eyes. Sarah's gaze sweeps over the boarding line and stops when it reaches Devon. Her smile falters for just a moment, a micro-expression that might go unnoticed by most, but Devon has been trained to watch for exactly these reactions. At the boarding scanner, Devon hands over his documents to Sarah personally. "Well, hello there," she says, her voice pitched higher than necessary, the way adults sometimes talk to children they're not sure how to address. "Traveling all by yourself today?" "Yes, ma'am." Sarah scans his boarding pass, and her eyebrows rise slightly. "Seat 2B. That's our premium location." She looks at him more closely, as if trying to solve a puzzle that doesn't quite fit together. "And you're sure this is correct?" "Yes, ma'am. My father made the reservation." "I see." Sarah's pause stretches just long enough to be uncomfortable. "Well, let's get you settled in. I'm Sarah, and I'll be taking care of you today." The phrase carries an undertone that makes Devon's shoulders tense. Not serving him, but taking care of him, as if he's a problem to be managed, rather than a passenger to be respected. As Devon walks down the jetway, he can feel Sarah's eyes following him. He's done this enough times now to recognize the pattern: initial skepticism, escalating scrutiny, eventual confrontation. The question isn't whether it will happen, but when and how far it will go. Professor Barnes boards behind him, nodding warmly as she passes. Marcus Webb follows, phone already out, and subtly recording the boarding process, his journalist instincts apparently activated. The first-class cabin of Flight 447 represents the pinnacle of airline luxury leather seats that convert to fully flat beds, personal entertainment screens, premium service from takeoff to landing. Devon has experienced it all before, but today feels different. Today feels like the culmination of something that's been building for months. He stows his bag in the overhead compartment and settles into seat 2B, pulling out his textbook again. The familiar routine calms his nerves as passengers continue boarding around him. Sarah reappears, her attention drawn to Devon like a magnet. "Can I get you anything before takeoff?" "Water juice." "Water would be nice, thank you." She returns with a bottle of water and hovers nearby, clearly wanting to say something more. Finally, "You know, honey, first class can be quite formal. Are you comfortable here?" It's a question loaded with subtext, and Devon recognizes it immediately. Not, "Are you comfortable?" but "Do you belong here?" "I'm quite comfortable, thank you," Devon replies, his voice steady, despite the tremor in his hands that he hides by gripping his pen tighter. Sarah's smile tightens. "Of course. Well, If you need anything at all, just let me know. As she moves away, Devon catches Professor Barnes watching the interaction with sharp, intelligent eyes. She's seen this before he realizes. She knows exactly what just happened, even if it was couched in politeness. Marcus Webb has also noticed his phone positioned to capture any future interactions without being obvious about it. The stage is set. All the players are in position. Devon opens his textbook to the page on exponential functions and begins to work, his handwriting slightly shakier than usual, despite his outward calm. Very soon, his education in mathematics will be overshadowed by a lesson in human nature that no textbook could ever teach. The boarding process continues around Devon like a choreographed dance of privilege and assumption. He keeps his head down, focused on his calculus problems, but his peripheral awareness remains sharp. This is part of his training to appear absorbed in his work, while actually monitoring every interaction, every glance, every whispered comment that might become relevant later. Sarah Mitchell moves through the first-class cabin with practiced efficiency, greeting passengers, checking overhead bins, ensuring everything meets the exacting standards that Atlantic Airlines promises its premium customers. But Devon notices that her route brings her past his seat more frequently than necessary, and her glances in his direction carry an intensity that has nothing to do with customer service. "Excuse me, sweetheart," she says during her third pass, her voice carrying that saccharine tone that adults sometimes use when they're trying to sound caring, but actually feel frustrated. "I noticed you're working on some pretty advanced math there." Devon looks up from his differential equations. "Yes, ma'am. It's homework." "Homework," Sarah repeats as if testing the words for authenticity. "That's wonderful. And how old are you, if you don't mind my asking?" 11. Sarah's eyebrows rise in what might be surprise or skepticism. 11. "And you're traveling all alone to Chicago?" "Yes, ma'am." For school, Devon has learned to answer these questions without volunteering more information than necessary. The more details he provides, the more opportunities he creates for disbelief or additional scrutiny. "Family visit." "I see." Sarah glances around the cabin, then back at Devon. Her next words come with the practiced concern of someone who believes she's being helpful. "You know, we have some wonderful seats in our main cabin that might be more comfortable for a young traveler. More interaction with families, other children." The suggestion hangs in the air between them like a trap waiting to be sprung. Devon has heard variations of this offer 16 times over the past 8 months. Sometimes it comes disguised as concern for his comfort. Sometimes as worry about disturbing other passengers. Always it carries the same underlying message. "You don't belong here." "Thank you for the suggestion," Devon says politely, "but I'm quite comfortable in my assigned seat." Professor Barnes, seated 2 rows back, clears her throat softly. "Flight attendant, I couldn't help but overhear. Is there some problem with the young man's seating assignment?" Sarah's customer service smile clicks back into place, but Devon catches the flash of irritation in her eyes. "Oh no, Professor Barnes." She glances at the manifest in her hand. "No problem at all. I was simply making sure all our passengers are comfortable." "He seems quite comfortable to me," Professor Barnes observes mildly. Her voice carries the authority of someone who spent 40 years in classrooms, recognizing troublemakers and protecting vulnerable students. "And that's impressive work he's doing. Calculus, isn't it?" "Yes, ma'am," Devon confirms. "Differential and integral calculus." At 11 years old, Professor Barnes says, and there's genuine admiration in her voice, "Your parents must be very proud." "They are," Devon says, and for the first time since boarding, his smile is completely genuine. Sarah's jaw tightens almost imperceptibly. Her voice becomes more clipped, more professional. "Well, if everyone's settled, I'll continue with pre-flight preparations." As she moves away, Marcus Webb leans slightly forward from his seat in 1C. Kid's got more composure than most business travelers I know, he murmurs to his seatmate, but his voice is pitched to carry just far enough for Devon to hear the support. Devon catches his eye and nods slightly, a small acknowledgement between fellow travelers who both recognize what's happening here. The last of the passengers board, and Captain Rodriguez's voice comes over the intercom. Flight attendants prepare for departure. Sarah begins the familiar safety demonstration, but Devon notices that her usual smooth delivery is slightly off rhythm today. She keeps glancing in his direction, as if his presence is somehow disrupting her normal routine. When she demonstrates the oxygen mask procedure, her movements are sharper, more agitated. Ladies and gentlemen, in the unlikely event of a water landing, Sarah's voice drones on, but Devon isn't listening to the words. He's watching body language, cataloging micro-expressions, noting the way other passengers respond to the service they receive versus the way he's been treated. During the safety demonstration, Michael Chen, the junior flight attendant, approaches Devon's row to check seatbelts and tray tables. He's younger than Sarah, maybe late 20s, with an easy smile and none of the tension that seems to radiate from his colleague. All set there, Buddy Michael asks, and his tone is genuinely friendly, the way he might speak to any passenger, regardless of age or race. "Yes, sir. Thank you." Michael notices the calculus textbook. "Wow, that's some serious math. I struggled with algebra in high school." It's actually pretty interesting once you understand the concepts, Devon says, and his enthusiasm for the subject shines through, making him look exactly like what he is, a bright kid who loves learning. "I bet it is. Well, enjoy your flight." As Michael moves on, Devon catches Sarah watching the interaction with something that looks almost like disapproval. When Michael reaches the galley, she pulls him aside for a whispered conversation that Devon can't quite hear. But their body language tells the story, Sarah gesturing in his direction with barely controlled agitation. Michael, looking confused and slightly uncomfortable, shaking his head. The plane pushes back from the gate, and Devon feels the familiar acceleration as they taxi toward the runway. His stomach knots with anticipation, not from flying, which holds no fear for him, but from what he knows is coming. As they reach cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign turns off, Sarah makes her way down the aisle again. This time her approach is more deliberate, more purposeful. She's made some kind of decision during the taxi and takeoff. "Devon," she says, using his name for the first time, having clearly checked the manifest. "I've been thinking about our earlier conversation." "Here it comes," Devon thinks. He sets down his pen and looks up at her with polite attention, though his hands tremble slightly as he places them in his lap. "You know, I've been flying for 12 years, and I've seen a lot of different situations. Sometimes, even when everything looks correct on paper, there can be misunderstandings." Misunderstandings. Devon keeps his voice neutral, curious rather than defensive. "Well, sometimes tickets get mixed up, or there are issues with payment processing that don't show up immediately in our system. I'd hate for you to be uncomfortable if there's been some kind of error." Professor Barnes has stopped reading her book and is now listening intently to the conversation. Marcus Webb has his phone positioned discreetly, though he's pretending to scroll through emails. "I don't believe there's been any error," Devon says carefully. "My father purchased this ticket directly through Atlantic Airlines website 3 weeks ago." "Your father," Sarah repeats, and there's something in her tone that makes the words sound like a question rather than a statement. "Yes, ma'am." "And what does your father do for work?" The question crosses a line that Devon has been waiting for someone to cross for 8 months. It's the moment when curiosity becomes interrogation, when concern becomes suspicion, when professionalism gives way to prejudice. "He works in business." Devon answers, keeping his response deliberately vague. "Business." Sarah echoes her voice, carrying a skepticism that she's no longer trying to hide. What kind of business? Professor Barnes stands up from her seat. "Excuse me, miss." She glances at Sarah's name tag. "Miss Mitchell, is there some policy that requires passengers to disclose their family's employment information?" Sarah's cheeks flush slightly. "Of course not. I was just making conversation." It seemed like more than conversation. Professor Barnes observes her voice carrying the steel of someone who has confronted injustice before. It seemed like an interrogation. Other passengers are beginning to notice the exchange. Conversations quiet as heads turn toward the developing confrontation. Sarah straightens her shoulders, reasserting her authority. "Professor Barnes, I appreciate your concern, but I'm simply ensuring that all our passengers are properly situated, according to their ticketing arrangements. The young man has shown you his boarding pass, his ID, and his documentation," Professor Barnes says firmly. "What more do you need to see?" "Sometimes," Sarah says, her voice rising slightly as her professional mask slips, "things aren't what they appear to be. Sometimes people end up in seats they haven't actually paid for." The accusation hangs in the air like a poisonous cloud. Devon feels the stares of other passengers, some sympathetic, some curious, some uncomfortable with the growing tension. His hands clench into fists in his lap, the first crack in his composure. Marcus Webb stops pretending to read his emails and looks directly at Sarah. "Are you suggesting that this kid somehow scammed his way into a first-class seat?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Sarah replies, but her defensive tone suggests otherwise. "I'm simply doing my job, which is to ensure that every passenger is in their correct assigned seat." "Then perhaps," says a new voice from across the aisle, "you should check everyone's tickets instead of focusing on one 11-year-old boy." The speaker is Dr. James Patterson, a distinguished-looking black man in his 60s who's been quietly observing the entire exchange. His voice carries the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and respected. Sarah's face flushes deeper. "Sir, I don't think you understand the situation." "I understand it perfectly," Dr. Patterson replies. "What I don't understand is why you're treating this young man differently than you've treated any other passenger on this flight." Devon sits quietly in the center of the growing storm, his hands folded in his lap to hide their shaking, his expression calm despite the turmoil around him. This is what his father prepared him for, the moment when other people's prejudices would reveal themselves so clearly that even the most willfully blind observer couldn't deny what was happening. But beneath his careful composure, he's still just an 11-year-old boy being publicly humiliated by an adult who's supposed to protect and serve him. "I'm going to have to ask everyone to return to their seats," Sarah announces, her voice shaking slightly with either anger or anxiety. "This disruption needs to end." "The only disruption I see," Professor Barnes says quietly, "is your harassment of this child." Sarah's professional composure finally cracks completely. "Fine." She snaps her mask, falling away entirely. "If everyone wants to make this difficult, we'll resolve it properly." She turns toward the cockpit, reaching for the internal phone that will connect her directly to the captain. Devon watches her go and quietly pulls out his own phone. He types a single message. "It's happening." The response comes back immediately. "Stay calm. Document everything. I'm already on my way." As Sarah speaks urgently into the cockpit phone, Devon opens his calculus textbook again and continues working on his differential equations, though his handwriting is shakier now, betraying the emotional cost of maintaining his dignity while adults debate his right to exist in the space he's legally purchased. But inside, his heart pounds with the knowledge that the real test is just beginning. Sarah Mitchell returns from the cockpit phone with the determination of someone who has crossed a point of no return. Her professional mask has slipped entirely, now replaced by something harder and more dangerous. Devon recognizes the look he's seen it 16 times before, on 16 different flights, worn by 16 different airline employees, who reached the moment where their prejudices overrode their training. Ladies and gentlemen, Sarah announces to the first-class cabin, her voice carrying an official authority that brooks no argument. I need everyone to remain in your seats while we resolve a seating irregularity. The phrase, seating irregularity, lands like a slap. Devon's pen stills on his calculus homework. After examining his boarding pass 4 times, checking his ID twice, and reviewing his unaccompanied minor documentation, she's still suggesting that his presence in seat 2B represents some kind of fraud. Michael Chen emerges from the galley, looking confused and uncomfortable. Sarah, what's going on? The captain is asking handle the beverage service. Sarah cuts him off sharply. I'll deal with this situation. She approaches Devon's row with measured steps. In her hand, she carries a clipboard and what appears to be a printed passenger manifest. Devon, she says, and the way she uses his name now sounds almost like an accusation. I've been reviewing our passenger list, and I need to verify some information with you. Devon sets down his pen. His hand shakes slightly as he does the only visible sign of the stress building inside him, and looks up at her with polite attention. Yes, ma'am. Your ticket was purchased with a credit card belonging to James Carter. What is your relationship to the cardholder? The question is technically reasonable. Unaccompanied minors should be traveling on tickets purchased by parents or guardians. But Devon has already provided documentation establishing this relationship, and Sarah's tone suggests she's not asking for clarification, but rather building a case. James Carter is my father, Devon replies steadily. And you have proof of this relationship? Devon reaches into his messenger bag and pulls out his folder of documents, the same papers he showed to the gate agents and to Sarah herself during boarding. His movements are careful, deliberate, but there's a weariness to them now. Yes, ma'am. Birth certificate showing James Carter as my father, notarized letter of permission for solo travel emergency contact information, and my school ID showing my name as Devon Carter. Sarah examines each document with exaggerated care, as if she's seeing them for the first time, rather than the third or fourth. Other passengers watch with growing discomfort as the interrogation continues. Professor Barnes stands up from her seat. Miss Mitchell, you've already verified these documents multiple times. What exactly are you looking for? Professor Barnes. Sarah says, without looking at her, I need to ask you to remain seated and allow me to perform my duties. Your duties don't include harassing paying passengers. Professor Barnes responds, her voice carrying decades of experience dealing with institutional bullying. This child has provided every piece of documentation you've requested, and you're still treating him like a criminal. Marcus Webb raises his phone slightly, no longer bothering to hide the fact that he's recording. This is absolutely unbelievable, he murmurs, but his voice carries clearly through the cabin. Sarah finally looks up from the documents, and her expression has hardened into something approaching hostility. Mr. Carter, she says, addressing Devon with exaggerated formality. I'm going to need you to come with me to the galley so we can make some phone calls to verify your travel authorization. It's phrased as a request, but her tone makes it clear that she considers it an order. Devon remains seated. His voice is steady, but quieter now, as if the weight of adult prejudice is physically pressing down on him. Ma'am, I've provided all the verification documents required by Atlantic Airlines unaccompanied minor policy. Is there something specific about those documents that concerns you? The question is simple, direct, and completely reasonable. It's also designed to force Sarah to articulate exactly why she continues to doubt Devon's legitimacy, despite having seen clear proof of his right to be on the flight. Sarah's jaw tightens. Sometimes documents can be altered or misrepresented. I've seen situations where people use fraudulent paperwork to access services they haven't actually paid for. The accusation is now explicit rather than implied. Sarah Mitchell is suggesting that 11-year-old Devon Carter has somehow forged official documents, in order to steal a first-class airplane seat. The cabin erupts in murmurs of disbelief and outrage. "That's absolutely ridiculous." Professor Barnes declares, her voice carrying the authority of someone who spent 40 years in education and has no patience for this level of foolishness. Dr. Patterson leans forward in his seat. "Young lady, I am a federal judge, and what you're suggesting constitutes a serious criminal accusation against a minor. Do you have any evidence whatsoever to support this claim?" Sarah's face goes pale as she realizes she's just accused a child of document fraud in front of a federal judge. But she's too far down this path to retreat now. "I'm not making accusations," she says defensively. "I'm following proper security protocols." "These aren't security protocols," Marcus Webb calls out from his seat. "This is harassment, and I'm getting every second of it on video." "Sir, I need to ask you to put your phone away," Sarah snaps. "Not happening," Marcus replies firmly. "This is a public space, and I have every right to record what's happening here." Michael Chen hovers uncertainly near the galley, clearly wanting to intervene, but unsure how to challenge his senior colleague. "Sarah," he says quietly, "maybe we should just—" "Michael, I told you to handle the beverage service." Sarah cuts him off again, her voice sharp with stress and authority. Devon watches all of this unfold around him with a strange sense of detachment. This is the moment his father prepared him for, when someone's prejudices would become so obvious, so undeniable, that even the most sympathetic observer couldn't dismiss them as misunderstanding or mistake. He reaches into his jacket pocket and activates the recording device hidden there. Not a phone, but professional-grade equipment that will capture every word of what's about to happen with courtroom-quality clarity. Miss Mitchell, Devon says, his voice cutting through the chaos with surprising authority for an 11-year-old. "I'd like to ask you a direct question." The cabin falls silent. Even Sarah pauses, perhaps surprised by the suddenly formal tone coming from someone she's been treating like a child. "Yes. Have you asked any other passenger on this flight to provide additional documentation beyond their boarding pass and ID?" It's a simple question, but it goes straight to the heart of the matter. Devon has been watching Sarah's interactions with other passengers since boarding began. He's seen her greet the businessman in 1A with a warm smile and no questions. He's watched her chat comfortably with the elderly couple in 3C without asking to see their identification. He's observed her treat Marcus Webb, Professor Barnes, and Dr. Patterson with the standard courtesy that first-class passengers expect and receive. Only Devon has been subjected to repeated document checks. Only Devon has been questioned about his father's profession. Only Devon has been accused of potential fraud. Sarah opens her mouth to respond, then closes it again, apparently realizing that any answer she gives will highlight the discriminatory nature of her behavior. I check documentation when the situation warrants additional scrutiny." "What about my situation warranted additional scrutiny?" Devon asks, and for the first time, his voice carries a slight tremor, not from fear, but from the emotional weight of having to defend his right to exist in a space he has every right to occupy. Again, Sarah struggles for an answer that won't explicitly reveal her bias. Unaccompanied minors require more careful verification. "But you verified my unaccompanied minor documentation during boarding," Devon points out with devastating logic. "And again, just now. What changed between then and now that made you doubt the authenticity of documents you had already approved?" Professor Barnes nods approvingly at Devon's reasoning. Marcus Webb's phone captures every word. Dr. Patterson watches with the intense interest of someone who recognizes a sharp legal mind at work, regardless of its owner's age. Sarah's face flushes with anger and embarrassment as she realizes that an 11-year-old has just systematically dismantled her justifications and exposed the racial profiling that motivated her behavior. "Young man," She says, her voice shaking slightly. I am the senior flight attendant on this aircraft, and I am responsible for ensuring the safety and security of all passengers. If I determine that additional verification is needed, that is my professional judgment, and you need to comply with my instructions. So you're asking me to move from my assigned seat? Devon says, his composure intact, but his hands now visibly trembling in his lap. Based on your professional judgment, that my presence here poses some kind of safety or security risk. That's correct. What specific risk do you believe I pose? The question hangs in the air like a challenge. Sarah realizes too late that Devon has maneuvered her into a position where she must either admit that her concerns are baseless or explicitly state that she considers his race or age to be threatening. She begins, then stops, apparently recognizing the trap she's walked into. Devon maintains his calm, respectful demeanor, but his next words carry the weight of someone who understands exactly what's happening and refuses to let it continue unchallenged, even as his voice wavers slightly with the emotion he's been suppressing. Miss Mitchell, my father taught me that when people feel the need to justify treating others differently, they usually reveal their true character in the process. I want to thank you for revealing yours. The words land like a physical blow. Several passengers gasp audibly. Professor Barnes sits back in her seat with something approaching awe at the 11-year-old's composure and wisdom. Sarah's professional facade finally crumbles completely. Fine, she snaps, reaching for the intercom phone. If you want to make this difficult, we'll resolve it the hard way. Her voice echoes throughout the cabin as she makes the announcement that will change everything. Captain Rodriguez, this is Sarah. I need security to board the aircraft immediately. We have a disruptive passenger refusing to comply with crew instructions. Devon quietly pulls out his personal phone and sends a text message. Security called. Phase 1 complete. The response comes back instantly. Proud of you. Stay strong. Justice is coming. As Sarah hangs up the intercom phone and turns back to face him with victorious satisfaction, Devon Carter opens his calculus textbook to a fresh page and begins working on a new problem. Though his hands shake now and his breathing is slightly uneven, the natural response of a child who has been forced to fight adult battles while maintaining impossible standards of dignity. The most difficult part of his mission is just beginning. The announcement of security's impending arrival transforms the atmosphere in the first-class cabin from tense concern to electric anticipation. Devon continues working on his calculus problems with deliberate focus, but his breathing has grown shallow, and he grips his pen tighter than necessary. He can feel the weight of every passenger's attention, some sympathetic, some uncomfortable, a few grimly satisfied that the situation is finally being handled properly. Sarah Mitchell stands near the galley entrance, like a general surveying a battlefield she believes she's winning. Her earlier uncertainty has been replaced by righteous conviction. She has called for backup, established her authority, and soon the disruptive element will be removed from her domain. Ladies and gentlemen, she announces to the cabin, we'll have this resolved shortly. I apologize for any inconvenience. Professor Barnes turns in her seat to face Sarah directly. The only inconvenience here is watching a child be harassed for the crime of existing in first class while black. The words hit the cabin like a thunderclap. Several passengers gasp. Others shift uncomfortably. A few nod in agreement. But Sarah's reaction is immediate and defensive. Professor Barnes, I resent that implication. Race has nothing to do with this situation. I follow standard security protocols for suspicious circumstances. Suspicious circumstances. Professor Barnes repeats, her voice heavy with decades of experience recognizing coded language. And what exactly is suspicious about a polite, well-dressed, well-documented child working on advanced mathematics homework? Marcus Webb stops pretending to use his phone for anything other than recording. I'll tell you what's suspicious, he says, his voice carrying clearly through the cabin. What's suspicious is that you've spent 20 minutes interrogating an 11-year-old who has done absolutely nothing wrong. Dr. Patterson adds his voice to the growing chorus. In my courtroom, we call this harassment without cause. When it's targeted based on race, we call it civil rights violation. Sarah's face flushes deeper with each criticism, but instead of reconsidering her actions, she doubles down. I don't care what you call it. This child is disrupting my cabin, refusing to follow crew instructions, and creating a hostile environment for other passengers. The accusation is so divorced from reality that it produces stunned silence. Devon has been sitting quietly in his assigned seat, speaking only when directly addressed, working on homework, maintaining perfect courtesy throughout Sarah's increasingly aggressive interrogation. Michael Chen finally finds his voice. Sarah, he's been completely respectful. He hasn't raised his voice, hasn't moved from his seat, hasn't done anything disruptive. Sarah whirls on her younger colleague. Michael, I am the senior flight attendant on this aircraft, and I make the decisions here. This passenger, she gestures toward Devon, has been non-compliant with security verification procedures. What procedures? Marcus Webb demands, his phone capturing every word. Show me in the Atlantic Airlines manual where it says you can repeatedly question a child who has valid documentation. Sir, you need to mind your own business, Sarah snaps. This became my business when you started harassing a kid in front of me, Marcus replies. And lucky for everyone, it's all being recorded for posterity. The mention of recording inflames Sarah further. Put that phone away immediately, or I'll have you removed as well. On what grounds? Dr. Patterson interjects. Recording in public spaces is legal, and this gentleman is documenting what appears to be discriminatory treatment of a minor. Sarah realizes she's losing control of the narrative, and her response is to escalate rather than de-escalate. She approaches Devon's seat with aggressive purpose, her voice loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. Devon Carter, I am ordering you to gather your belongings and move to seat 23B in the main cabin. Your continued presence in first class is disruptive to other passengers and potentially fraudulent. The word fraudulent echoes through the cabin like an accusation of murder. To call an 11-year-old boy fraudulent in public in front of witnesses, based on nothing more than suspicion, rooted in racial bias, represents a level of professional misconduct that shocks even the most jaded travelers. Devon looks up from his calculus textbook. His hands shake visibly now as he grips the edges of his book, but his voice remains steady. Miss Mitchell, I have a confirmed reservation for seat 2B, purchased legally with a valid credit card, and I have provided all required documentation. On what specific grounds are you ordering me to change seats? On the grounds that I am the senior flight attendant, and I have determined that your presence here is inappropriate. Inappropriate how? Sarah struggles for an answer that won't explicitly reveal her bias, but she's too deep into this confrontation to maintain any pretense. You don't fit the demographic profile of our typical first-class passengers. The words hang in the air like a confession. Several passengers gasp audibly. Professor Barnes covers her mouth with her hand in shock. Marcus Webb's phone captures every word. Even Michael Chen looks stunned. Sarah, you can't say things like that. But Sarah, having crossed the line into explicit discrimination, decides to defend her position rather than retreat. I can, and I will. This airline serves a certain clientele with certain expectations, and part of my job is maintaining the appropriate atmosphere. The appropriate atmosphere? Devon repeats quietly, and his voice wavers slightly, the first crack in his composure. And what atmosphere would that be? A professional, upscale environment that matches the premium service we provide. Devon's next question cuts to the heart of the matter. though his voice is smaller now, more vulnerable. And you believe my presence disrupts that atmosphere. Sarah hesitates, perhaps finally recognizing the legal and professional quicksand she's stepping into. But her prejudice overrides her caution. I believe that when passengers appear to be in seats above their circumstances, it creates confusion and potential conflicts. Professor Barnes stands up from her seat, her voice shaking with anger and disbelief. Did you just suggest that this child is somehow beneath the circumstances of first-class travel? I'm suggesting that there are patterns and indicators that experienced flight attendants learn to recognize. Sarah replies defensively. Patterns and indicators. Dr. Patterson says, his judicial tone turning ice cold. Would you care to elaborate on these patterns you use to determine whether passengers belong in first class? Sarah realizes she's being cross-examined by a federal judge, but she's too deep into her justifications to stop now. Physical presentation, behavior patterns, familiarity with premium service expectations. Physical presentation. Marcus Webb repeats, still recording. You mean his skin color? I never said anything about skin color, Sarah protests, but her defensive tone confirms what everyone already knows. Devon closes his calculus textbook and looks directly at Sarah Mitchell. When he speaks, his voice carries a maturity that seems impossible from an 11-year-old, though there's a slight tremor that betrays the emotional cost this is taking on him. Miss Mitchell, you're right about patterns. For the past 8 months, I've been traveling extensively on various airlines, documenting exactly the kind of treatment I've received from you today. What I've learned is that prejudice follows very predictable patterns. Sarah blinks, confused by the sudden shift in Devon's tone and the implications of his words. First, Devon continues, his voice stronger now as he channels his pain into purpose. Comes the initial suspicion based purely on appearance. Then repeated document verification that isn't required of other passengers. Then questions about family background and financial circumstances. Then suggestions to move to more appropriate seating. Finally, when all else fails, accusations of fraud or disruption. Professor Barnes stares at Devon with growing amazement. Marcus Webb's phone captures every word. Dr. Patterson leans forward with sharp interest. You've followed the pattern exactly. Devon says, his voice remaining calm and respectful despite the devastating precision of his analysis. The only variable is how far each person is willing to go before their better judgment stops them. Sarah's face goes pale as she realizes this 11-year-old has just systematically deconstructed her behavior and revealed it as part of a larger documented pattern of discrimination. I don't know what you're implying, she stammers. I'm not implying anything, Devon replies, and now his voice carries a strength that seems to come from somewhere deeper than his years. I'm stating facts. And the fact is that your treatment of me today will be documented alongside similar incidents from 16 other flights over the past 8 months. The cabin falls completely silent, except for the background hum of the aircraft engines. Everyone stares at Devon, trying to process what they've just heard. Sarah's voice drops to almost a whisper. Who are you? Devon's answer is simple and devastating. I'm exactly who I told you I was. The son of James Carter. The difference is you never bothered to find out who James Carter is. Before Sarah can respond, the intercom crackles with Captain Rodriguez's voice. Flight attendants, we have security personnel boarding the aircraft. Please escort them to the situation. Sarah straightens up, apparently believing that the arrival of security will vindicate her actions and resolve the situation in her favor. You'll see, she tells Devon, though her voice lacks some of its earlier conviction. When security hears about your disruption and non-compliance, they'll remove you immediately. Devon pulls out his phone, his hands steadier now that he's revealed part of his mission. He sends a single text, security boarding now. Are you ready? The response comes back immediately. Born ready. Time to show them who they're dealing with. As footsteps echo from the jetway announcing the arrival of airport security, Devon Carter opens his calculus textbook again and continues working on his differential equations. But now, there's something different in his posture. Not the careful defensiveness of a child being bullied, but the quiet confidence of someone who knows that justice is about to be served. The storm is about to break, and Devon Carter is ready for it. The footsteps in the jetway grow louder, and two Atlantic Airlines security officers appear in the first-class cabin doorway. The lead officer is Thomas Jackson, a tall black man in his 40s, with graying hair, and the bearing of someone who has spent 20 years navigating complex situations involving authority race and institutional power. Behind him follows Officer Kate Sullivan, a white woman in her 30s, with a no-nonsense demeanor and a clipboard that suggests she handles these situations by strictly following established protocols. Sarah Mitchell immediately approaches them with the confidence of someone who believes backup has arrived to vindicate her actions. Officers, thank you for responding quickly. We have a passenger in seat 2B who has been disruptive and non-compliant with crew instructions. She gestures toward Devon, who continues working on his calculus homework with deliberate focus. Officer Jackson's eyes sweep the cabin, taking in the scene, an 11-year-old black child sitting quietly with a textbook, surrounded by agitated passengers, half of whom appear upset with the flight attendant, rather than the supposed disruptive passenger. What exactly has the passenger done? Jackson asks, his tone professional, but carrying an undertone that suggests he's already skeptical. He has refused to comply with security verification procedures. Sarah explains, her voice gaining confidence, as she believes she's found allies. Despite multiple attempts to verify his documentation, he has been argumentative and disruptive to other passengers. Jackson glances around the cabin again. Professor Barnes, Marcus Webb, and Dr. Patterson all appear ready to contradict Sarah's characterization, but Jackson raises his hand slightly, indicating he wants to hear the official version first. Officer Sullivan steps forward with her clipboard. What documentation has been requested and provided? Boarding pass identification, unaccompanied, minor paperwork, emergency contact information, and birth certificate. Sarah lists, apparently unaware that the extensive nature of her verification requests undermines, rather than supports her position. Jackson's eyebrows rise slightly. All of which were provided. Yes, but, and were they valid and in order? Sarah hesitates. They appeared to be, but sometimes documents can be altered. Or, do you have specific reason to believe these documents were fraudulent? Officer Sullivan interrupts, consulting her clipboard. Well, no specific reason, but the passenger seems out of place in first class. The phrase hangs in the air like a smoking gun. Jackson's expression hardens almost imperceptibly, while Sullivan's pen stops moving. Jackson approaches Devon's seat with careful neutrality. Son, I'm Officer Jackson with Atlantic Airlines Security. Can I see your boarding pass and identification? Devon looks up from his calculus textbook, his composure intact, but his eyes showing the strain of the past hour. Yes, sir. Here's my boarding pass for seat 2B, my government ID, and my unaccompanied minor documentation. Jackson examines each document thoroughly, but his review takes only a minute, a sharp contrast to Sarah's repeated extended examinations of the same paperwork. Everything appears to be in perfect order, Jackson announces to the cabin. Valid reservation, proper identification, complete, unaccompanied minor documentation. But Officer Jackson. Sarah protests, you don't understand the full situation. This passenger has been argumentative and disruptive. Professor Barnes can no longer remain silent. That is absolutely false. This young man has been nothing but polite and respectful throughout your harassment. Jackson turns to Professor Barnes. Ma'am, can you describe what you've observed? I am Professor Helen Barnes, retired from Howard University. I have watched this entire interaction from the beginning. Her voice carries the authority of decades in academia. Miss Mitchell has repeatedly questioned this child's right to be in first class, demanded multiple verifications of valid documentation, and accused him of fraud, all without any justification whatsoever. Marcus Webb raises his phone. Officer, I've been recording this entire incident. This kid has been completely respectful, while the flight attendant has been increasingly hostile and discriminatory. Officer Sullivan looks at her partner with growing concern. Tom, this doesn't sound like a disruptive passenger situation. But Sarah, feeling her authority and credibility crumbling, decides to escalate rather than retreat. Officers, I don't think you understand who you're dealing with here. This child has been manipulative and defiant. When I asked him to move to a more appropriate seat, he refused and began causing a scene. Dr. Patterson stands up from his seat. I'm sorry, but I can't listen to any more of this. His voice carries the weight of judicial authority. I am Judge James Patterson of the Federal District Court, and what I've witnessed here is textbook discrimination. This flight attendant has singled out this child based solely on his race and age, subjected him to harassment that no other passenger has experienced, and now she's lying about his behavior to justify her actions. The weight of a federal judge's testimony stops the conversation cold. Officer Jackson looks directly at Sarah, and his professional neutrality shifts towards skepticism. Miss Mitchell, Judge Patterson is alleging that you've treated this passenger differently than others based on his race. How do you respond? Sarah's face flushes with anger and panic. That's completely false. I don't see race. I treat all passengers equally. I was simply following security protocols. What security protocols? Officer Sullivan asks, consulting her clipboard. Because requiring multiple document verifications from a passenger who has already provided valid documentation isn't standard procedure. Devon quietly sets down his pen and addresses Officer Jackson directly. Sir, may I ask you something? Jackson nods, impressed, despite himself by the child's composure under pressure. In your experience, how often do unaccompanied minors traveling in first class pose security risks requiring special investigation beyond standard documentation review? It's a devastatingly precise question that goes straight to the heart of the matter. Jackson has been in airline security for 2 decades, and he knows the answer as well as everyone else in the cabin. Son, in 20 years of doing this job, I've never encountered a security situation involving an unaccompanied minor in first class who had proper documentation. Sarah realizes she's losing ground rapidly. But Officer Jackson, you can't just look at documentation. You have to consider context behavior patterns, whether passengers fit the profile of what Jackson interrupts, his tone sharpening. Sarah stops, apparently recognizing that finishing that sentence will destroy her career. Officer Sullivan steps in. Miss Mitchell profiling passengers based on race, age, or appearance violates both Atlantic Airlines policy and federal civil rights law. Michael Chen, who has been watching this exchange with growing horror, finally finds his voice. Sarah, please stop talking. You're making this worse. But Sarah, cornered and desperate, makes the decision that will define the rest of her career. I don't care what any of you think. I am the senior flight attendant on this aircraft, and I have the authority to remove passengers who don't belong here. Don't belong here, Devon repeats quietly, and everyone in the cabin hears the pain beneath his calm exterior. His hands grip the armrests of his seat, knuckles showing white against his dark skin. Officer Jackson's professional neutrality finally cracks. Miss Mitchell, you just said that a passenger with valid documentation displaying perfect behavior doesn't belong in a seat he legally purchased because he doesn't fit your idea of who should fly first class. Do you understand the legal implications of what you just said? Sarah's voice rises to near shouting. Fine. Yes, I said it. Some passengers just don't fit the first-class environment, and part of my job is maintaining standards. The cabin erupts in gasps of shock and outrage. Marcus Webb's phone captures every word. Professor Barnes shakes her head in disbelief. Doctor, Patterson pulls out his own phone, apparently making notes for future legal reference. Officer Sullivan looks at her partner. Tom, I think we have a problem here, but it's not with the passenger. Jackson nods grimly. Miss Mitchell, you've just admitted to discriminating against a passenger based on your subjective judgment about who belongs in first class. That's not your decision to make, and it's not legally permissible. Devon stands up from his seat for the first time since the confrontation began. At 11 years old, he barely reaches Jackson's shoulder, but when he speaks, his voice carries remarkable authority, despite the slight tremor that betrays his emotional state. Officer Jackson, I appreciate your professionalism and fairness. I'd like to make a request. What's that, son? I'd like you to escort me off the aircraft. Everyone stares at Devon in surprise. Sarah looks triumphant, apparently believing she's finally won. But son Jackson says gently, You haven't done anything wrong. You have every right to remain in your seat. Devon's next words will resonate through the cabin and far beyond. Though his voice wavers slightly with emotion, I know I have the right to stay. But I also have the right to leave with my dignity intact. And I choose dignity over fighting a system that's determined to see me as a problem rather than a person. The 11-year-old's wisdom and grace under pressure leave the adults around him speechless. However, Devon continues pulling out his phone with hands that tremble slightly before we go. I think there's someone who would like to speak with Miss Mitchell. He dials a number and hands the phone to Officer Jackson. Could you please tell the person who answers exactly what has happened here today? Jackson takes the phone hesitantly. Hello, this is Officer Thomas Jackson with Atlantic Airlines Security. Yes, sir. I can explain the situation. As Jackson describes the incident to whoever is on the other end of the line, his expression changes from professional neutrality to surprise to something approaching shock. Yes, sir. I understand, sir. Yes, he's right here. No, sir. He's been completely respectful throughout. Yes, sir. I can confirm that. Right away, sir. Jackson hands the phone back to Devon, his expression now mixing respect with curiosity. Son, your father would like everyone to remain exactly where they are. He's coming to handle this personally. Sarah, still oblivious to the magnitude of her mistake, smirks. His father. What's his father going to do? Complain to customer service? Officer Jackson looks at her with something approaching pity. Miss Mitchell, I suggest you prepare yourself for the conversation of your lifetime. Devon sits back down in seat 2B, opens his calculus textbook again, and returns to his differential equations, as if nothing extraordinary has happened. But his hands are steadier now, and there's something different in his posture, the quiet confidence of someone who knows that justice is about to arrive. Everyone in that cabin knows they're about to witness something unprecedented. Despite Officer Jackson's clear assessment of the situation, and his obvious reluctance to precede Sarah Mitchell's authority as senior flight attendant ultimately prevails in the bureaucratic hierarchy of commercial aviation. Atlantic Airlines policy is clear. When flight crew requests, passenger removal security must comply first and investigate later. I'm sorry, son, Officer Jackson tells Devon, genuine regret evident in his voice and posture. I have to follow crew instructions even when I disagree with them. Officer Sullivan looks equally uncomfortable but consults her clipboard and nods. Regulations require us to escort you off the aircraft while this gets sorted out through proper channels. Devon closes his calculus textbook and carefully places it in his messenger bag. His movements are deliberate, dignified, but there's a slight tremor in his hands, the natural response of a child who has been forced to endure an hour of adult prejudice and public humiliation. I understand, Officer Jackson. You're doing your job, and I respect that. His maturity in the face of discrimination leaves the adults around him both humbled and ashamed. Sarah stands near the galley, with her arms crossed, a look of vindicated satisfaction on her face. Finally, maybe now we can get back to providing proper service to our legitimate passengers. The words hit the cabin like a slap. Professor Barnes gasps audibly. Dr. Patterson shakes his head in disgust. Marcus Webb's phone captures every moment as the 11-year-old gathers his belongings with quiet dignity. Miss Mitchell Officer Jackson says, his voice tight with controlled anger, that was completely inappropriate. It was completely honest, Sarah retorts. Some people need to learn their place. The phrase, learn their place, echoes through the first-class cabin like an admission of guilt. Even Officer Sullivan winces at the explicit nature of the discrimination. Devon stands up from seat 2B and looks around the cabin at the passengers who have witnessed his humiliation. His voice, when he speaks, carries no anger or bitterness, only a sadness that seems far too profound for someone his age, though it wavers slightly with the emotion he's been holding back. I want to thank everyone who stood up for me today. Professor Barnes, Dr. Patterson, Mr. Webb, Mr. Chen. You didn't have to get involved, but you chose to speak up for what's right. That means more to me than you'll ever know. Professor Barnes wipes away tears she hasn't been able to hold back. Sweetheart, you have shown more grace and courage than most adults I know. Devon nods respectfully, then turns to face Sarah Mitchell directly. When he speaks, his voice is stronger, drawing from some deep reserve of strength his father taught him to access. Miss Mitchell, my father taught me that every interaction is a choice between kindness and cruelty, between justice and prejudice, between building people up and tearing them down. Today, you revealed exactly who you choose to be. Sarah's face flushes with anger at being lectured by someone she considers beneath her authority. Don't you dare talk to me about choices. I chose to maintain professional standards, which is more than your parents taught you about respecting authority. The insult to his parents breaks through Devon's calm facade for just a moment. His jaw tightens. His small hands clench briefly into fists, and his breathing quickens. But then, with visible effort that shows exactly how much this is costing him, he regains his composure. Ma'am, my parents taught me that respecting authority means expecting authority figures to be worthy of respect. They also taught me that dignity isn't something that can be taken from you. It's something you choose to keep, even when others try to strip it away. Officer Jackson places a gentle hand on Devon's shoulder. Son, we need to go now. As they move toward the aircraft door, other passengers begin standing up from their seats. Professor Barnes gathers her purse and follows them into the aisle. Dr. Patterson closes his laptop and joins the exodus. Marcus Webb continues filming while walking behind them. Where are you all going? Sarah demands, her voice rising with panic as she realizes her actions are driving away other first-class passengers. Off this aircraft, Professor Barnes declares firmly. I refuse to fly with an airline that treats children this way. Dr. Patterson adds his voice. Miss Mitchell, your behavior today has been so egregiously discriminatory that I'm obligated to report it to federal authorities. I won't remain on an aircraft where civil rights violations are occurring with management approval. Marcus Webb stops recording long enough to address Sarah directly. Lady, I've got millions of followers on social media. By tonight, everyone in America is going to know exactly how Atlantic Airlines treats black children. I hope your moment of power was worth destroying your company's reputation. Sarah watches in growing horror as 5 first-class passengers voluntarily deplane rather than remain on an aircraft where discrimination has been allowed to flourish. You can't all leave. This is ridiculous. He's just one kid. That's the problem, Professor Barnes says, As she passes Sarah, her voice carrying decades of experience fighting prejudice. To you, he's just one kid whose dignity doesn't matter. To us, he's everyone's child, and his dignity matters more than our convenience. As the group reaches the aircraft door, Devon pauses and turns back toward the cabin. Flight attendant Michael Chen approaches him quickly. "Devon, I am so sorry," Michael says, his voice shaking with emotion and shame. "This isn't who we are. This isn't who Atlantic Airlines is supposed to be." Devon looks at the young flight attendant with compassion that seems impossible from someone who has just been so cruelly treated. "Mr. Chen, you tried to do the right thing within a system that made it difficult. That matters too." As Devon steps off the aircraft, Sarah calls out one final cruelty. "Good riddance. Maybe next time you'll fly where you actually belong." The words carry clearly through the cabin and into the jetway, where Officer Jackson stops walking and turns around with an expression of barely controlled fury. "Miss Mitchell, you have just crossed every line of professional conduct, human decency, and legal permissibility that exists in commercial aviation. I strongly suggest you stop talking immediately." But Sarah, drunk on her perceived victory and oblivious to the magnitude of her mistake, continues her tirade. "I've been protecting the integrity of first-class service for 12 years, and I won't apologize for maintaining standards." Professor Barnes, who has witnessed decades of discrimination in academic and professional settings, turns back toward the cabin. "Miss Mitchell, what you've maintained today isn't standards. It's systemic racism. And thanks to Mr. Webb's video, the entire world is going to see exactly what that looks like." As the group moves through the jetway toward the terminal, Devon pulls out his phone and sends a text message. "Removed from aircraft. Multiple witnesses. Everything documented." Sarah Mitchell revealed herself completely. The response comes back immediately. "Perfect. I'm in the terminal now. Time to show them who they're dealing with." Officer Jackson escorts Devon to the security office as required by protocol, but his demeanor has shifted from professional duty to protective concern. "Son, I want you to know that what happened in there was wrong. Dead wrong." Devon settles into a chair in the small office, while Officer Sullivan begins the mandatory paperwork. His composure is intact, but the emotional toll is visible in the way he sits, shoulders slightly slumped, hands clasped tightly in his lap. "Officer Jackson, can I ask you something?" "Of course. In your 20 years of doing this job, have you ever seen anything like what just happened?" Jackson considers the question carefully. "I've seen discrimination before, son, but I've never seen anyone handle it with the grace and dignity you showed today. Most adults would have lost their temper, started shouting, made the situation worse. You turned their prejudice into a mirror that showed everyone exactly who they really are." Devon nods thoughtfully, though his voice is quieter now, more vulnerable. "My father taught me that anger gives prejudiced people an excuse to dismiss you, but dignity and truth make it impossible for them to hide behind their justifications." Officer Sullivan looks up from her paperwork. "Devon, your father raised you right." "He did." Devon says simply, then adds with a slight smile that doesn't quite hide his exhaustion. "He also taught me to document everything." Before either officer can ask what he means, commotion erupts in the terminal corridor outside the security office. Voices, footsteps, the sound of people moving with urgent purpose. Officer Jackson glances toward the door. Sounds like something's happening out there. Devon checks his phone, and his smile becomes more genuine. "Yes, sir. I believe something is definitely happening." The door to the security office opens, and a tall figure appears silhouetted against the bright terminal lighting. Even from behind, his presence commands immediate attention. Expensive tailored suit, confident posture, the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to authority and respect. Jonathan Carter steps into the security office, and Officer Jackson immediately understands why Devon has remained so calm throughout his ordeal. This is not just any concerned parent. This is someone whose mere presence shifts the balance of power in any room he enters. Officer Jackson. Jonathan says, his voice carrying quiet authority that requires no introduction or explanation. I understand you've had some difficulty with my son's flight arrangements. Jackson stands up instinctively, recognizing power when he encounters it. Mr. Carter, your son has been nothing but respectful throughout this entire situation. The problem isn't with him. I know, Jonathan replies, his gaze moving to Devon, with a mixture of pride and protective fury that makes him seem even more formidable. The problem is with an airline employee who decided that my 11-year-old son doesn't deserve the dignity and respect that every human being is entitled to. Devon stands up from his chair and embraces his father. For the first time since the ordeal began, he looks like what he actually is, a child who has been hurt by adult cruelty and needs comfort from someone who loves him. His careful composure finally cracks slightly as he leans into his father's protective embrace. I documented everything, Dad, Devon says quietly, his voice finally showing the strain he's been under. Just like you taught me. Jonathan's smile is fierce with pride and love. I know you did, son. And now it's time for the adults to handle what comes next. Officer Sullivan clears her throat uncertainly. Mr. Carter, we're just finishing up the incident report. Your son will be free to go once we complete the paperwork. Jonathan's attention shifts to her, and his tone becomes formal, measured, dangerous. Officer Sullivan, I appreciate your professionalism in this matter. However, I think you should know that this incident report will become evidence in federal civil rights violation proceedings. The words hit the small office like a bomb. Officer Jackson's eyes widen. Officer Sullivan's pen stops moving on her clipboard. Devon looks up at his father, and despite everything he's been through, there's anticipation in his voice. Dad, are you ready to show them who they're dealing with? Jonathan Carter straightens his tie, checks his phone, and smiles at his son with the confidence of someone who has been planning for exactly this moment. Son, I've been ready for this conversation my entire career. As father and son prepare to leave the security office together, neither Officer Jackson nor Officer Sullivan has any idea that they've just witnessed the opening act of a drama that will reshape their entire industry. But they're about to find out. The terminal corridor outside the security office buzzes with unusual activity as Jonathan Carter emerges with Devon at his side. Airport employees pause in their duties. Passengers turn to stare, and an electric sense of anticipation fills the air around them. This isn't the typical scene of an angry parent arriving to complain about poor service. This is something far more significant. Behind Jonathan, 3 figures follow in perfect formation, a sharp-dressed woman with a tablet and the bearing of someone accustomed to high-stakes legal battles, a distinguished man in his 50s whose press credentials identify him as senior communications staff, and a third individual whose security posture and discreet earpiece mark him as professional protection. Devon, Jonathan says quietly as they walk, placing a protective hand on his son's shoulder. I want you to understand something about what's about to happen. Yes, Dad. Devon's voice is steadier now, strengthened by his father's presence. This isn't about revenge against Sarah Mitchell, or even Atlantic Airlines specifically. This is about changing a system that allowed what happened to you today to be considered acceptable behavior. Devon nods solemnly, his earlier vulnerability replaced by renewed purpose. We documented the pattern so we could break it. Exactly. As they approach Gate 12, a small crowd has gathered. Professor Barnes, Dr. Patterson, and Marcus Webb stand near the boarding area, along with several other passengers who deplaned in protest. Their phones are out, some still recording others, posting updates to social media, where Devon's story is already beginning to gain traction. Airport executive Maria Santos hurries toward them, flanked by two Atlantic Airlines corporate representatives who have clearly been summoned from their offices in urgent haste. Santos recognizes power when she sees it. Jonathan Carter's presence, his legal team, his security detail, and she approaches with the careful respect reserved for people who can make or break careers with a single phone call. Mr. Carter, Santos begins, "I'm Maria Santos, Airport Operations Director. I understand there was an incident aboard Flight 447, and I want to assure you that we're taking this matter very seriously." Jonathan's response is measured, professional, and absolutely devastating in its implications. "Ms. Santos, what happened aboard Flight 447 wasn't an incident. It was a systematic violation of my son's civil rights, captured on video, witnessed by multiple passengers, and documented as part of an ongoing investigation into discriminatory practices across the commercial aviation industry." The words hit like a series of precision strikes. Santos's face goes pale as she processes the legal landmines scattered throughout Jonathan's statement. The Atlantic Airlines representatives exchange panicked glances. Attorney Rachel Kim steps forward with her tablet. "Ms. Santos, we'll need to review all security footage from today's events. Crew manifests, training records for flight attendant Sarah Mitchell, and any internal communications regarding this incident. Additionally," adds PR Director David Cross, consulting his phone, "we'll need statements from Atlantic Airlines Corporate regarding their policies on passenger profiling and discrimination training." Santos realizes she's facing a coordinated legal and public relations assault of professional caliber. "Mr. Carter, perhaps we could discuss this privately in my office." "There's nothing private about what happened to my son," Jonathan interrupts firmly. "Your employee humiliated an 11-year-old child in front of a cabin full of witnesses, explicitly stated that he didn't belong in first class because he didn't fit her idea of appropriate demographics, and then had him removed from the aircraft for the crime of existing while black." Professor Barnes approaches the group, having overheard the conversation. "Mr. Carter, I witnessed everything that happened on that aircraft. Your son conducted himself with extraordinary dignity throughout a shameful display of prejudice." Dr. Patterson joins them, extending his hand. Judge James Patterson, Federal District Court. "Mr. Carter, I want you to know that what I observed today constitutes clear civil rights violations. I'll be happy to provide testimony." Marcus Webb holds up his phone. "I've got the entire incident recorded. It's already been viewed over 100,000 times in the past hour, and it's spreading rapidly across every social media platform." Jonathan acknowledges each witness with professional gratitude, but his attention remains focused on the Atlantic Airlines representatives, who have been silently hoping this situation might be contained through quiet negotiations. "Mr. Carter." One of them ventures. "I'm Patricia Hawkins, Regional Vice President for Atlantic Airlines. I want to personally apologize for any misunderstanding that occurred today." Ms. Hawkins. Jonathan cuts her off with surgical precision. "There was no misunderstanding. Your employee, Sarah Mitchell, deliberately discriminated against my son based on his race and age, violated multiple company policies and federal civil rights statutes, and then compounded her misconduct by lying about his behavior to justify her actions." The crowd around Gate 12 has grown as word spreads through the terminal. Other passengers, airport employees, and media representatives, drawn by the unusual commotion, gather to witness what appears to be a significant confrontation between a powerful man and a major airline. Devon stands quietly beside his father, observing the adult world of corporate damage control and legal maneuvering that his 8 months of investigation has set in motion. Despite being the victim at the center of this drama, he remains composed and thoughtful, occasionally taking notes in a small journal. Dad Devon says quietly, "Should I show them the recordings now?" Jonathan places a protective hand on his son's shoulder. "Not yet, son. Let's see how honest they want to be first." Patricia Hawkins, desperate to contain what she recognizes as a public relations catastrophe in the making, attempts a conciliatory approach. "Mr. Carter, I can assure you that Atlantic Airlines does not tolerate discrimination of any kind. If there was inappropriate behavior by our crew member, we will investigate thoroughly and take appropriate action." If there was inappropriate behavior, Professor Barnes interjects with barely controlled outrage. "I sat there and watched your flight attendant repeatedly harass this child, question his right to occupy a seat he had legally purchased, and then have him removed when he refused to be intimidated." Marcus Webb adds, "Lady, I've got it all on video. Your flight attendant said this kid didn't fit the demographic profile of first-class passengers. She told him to learn his place. There's no if about it." The crowd murmurs with shock and anger as details of Sarah Mitchell's behavior spread through the gathering. Several people begin pulling out their phones to record what's clearly becoming a significant news event. Jonathan Carter checks his watch, then looks directly at Patricia Hawkins, with the calm intensity of someone who has been building toward this moment for months. "Ms. Hawkins, I appreciate your concern about Atlantic Airlines' reputation. In fact, I share that concern, which is why I've spent the past 8 months conducting a comprehensive investigation into discriminatory practices across your route network." Hawkins's face drains of color. "Investigation." "That's correct. My son Devon has been traveling extensively on Atlantic Airlines flights, documenting his experiences, recording interactions, and gathering evidence of systematic bias in your customer service operations." The revelation hits the assembled crowd like a bombshell. Devon, the quiet 11-year-old who has been treated as a victim, is revealed to be a deliberate investigator, gathering evidence of institutional discrimination. Rachel Kim produces a thick folder from her briefcase. "We have documented evidence from 23 separate flights over 8 months. Discriminatory treatment, inappropriate questioning, seating challenges, and hostile service, all targeting a minor passenger who consistently displayed perfect behavior and proper documentation." David Cross adds, "The video from today's incident has already gone viral, but it's actually the capstone of a much larger investigation into airline discrimination patterns." Airport Security Director approaches the group clearly concerned about the growing crowd and media attention. "Mr. Carter, perhaps we could continue this conversation in a more private setting." Jonathan's response is firm, but not hostile. Director, "What happened to my son today happened in public, was witnessed by dozens of people, and was recorded for posterity. The conversation about accountability will also happen in public." Devon speaks up for the first time since the confrontation began, his young voice carrying clearly through the crowd. "Say, Hawkins, can I ask you a question?" Hawkins, thrown off balance by being addressed directly by the child at the center of this crisis, nods uncertainly. "In your position as regional vice president, do you believe that an 11-year-old boy with proper documentation and perfect behavior should be removed from his paid seat because a flight attendant thinks he doesn't look like he belongs in first class?" The question is simple, direct, and impossible to answer without either defending discrimination or admitting systematic failure. Hawkins realizes she's being cross-examined by a child with the precision of an experienced attorney. "Of course not," she says finally. "No child should ever be treated that way." Then why Devon continues with devastating logic. "Has it happened to me 23 times on Atlantic Airlines flights without any corrective action from your company?" The crowd falls silent as the full implications of Devon's questions sink in. This isn't an isolated incident by one problematic employee. It's evidence of a systematic pattern of discrimination that Atlantic Airlines has allowed to continue unchecked. Jonathan steps closer to Patricia Hawkins. his voice dropping to a tone that somehow manages to be both quiet and commanding. Ms. Hawkins, I think it's time you knew exactly who you're dealing with. I'm sorry, I'm Jonathan Carter, Chief Executive Officer of Meridian Aerospace Corporation. The words hang in the air like a detonation. Patricia Hawkins's face goes from pale to ashen as she processes the implications. Meridian Aerospace, she repeats weakly, the defense contractor. Among other things, yes. We're also the parent company of Meridian Holdings, which manages a diversified portfolio of investments in transportation logistics and related industries. Jonathan pauses, letting the information settle before delivering the final blow, including a controlling 52% ownership stake in Atlantic Airlines. The crowd erupts in gasps, murmurs, and scattered applause as the full scope of what they've witnessed becomes clear. Sarah Mitchell didn't just discriminate against any black child, she discriminated against the son of the man who owns the airline. Patricia Hawkins staggers backward, as if physically struck. The other Atlantic Airlines representatives look like they want to disappear entirely. Maria Santos realizes she's been watching the owner of a major airline being mistreated by his own employees. Devon looks up at his father with quiet pride. Dad, should I show them the equipment now? Jonathan nods. Time to show them what we've really been doing, son. Devon opens his messenger bag and carefully removes what appears to be standard travel electronics, a tablet, a smartphone, a portable charger. But as he demonstrates each device, their true purpose becomes clear. Professional audio gear. He explains to the stunned crowd, holding up a device no larger than a phone. Broadcast quality. He holds up his smartphone, HD video camera with stabilization and low-light capabilities. Finally, he produces his tablet. Real-time upload system. Everything goes directly to secure servers for legal documentation. The crowd stares at the 11-year-old, who has just revealed himself to be a sophisticated investigator, using professional equipment to document civil rights violations. Every interaction with Atlantic Airlines personnel over the past 8 months has been recorded, uploaded, and legally authenticated. Devon explains with matter-of-fact delivery that leaves everyone speechless. Sarah Mitchell's treatment of me today represents the most extreme example of behavior we've documented, but it's part of a clear pattern of institutional discrimination. Professor Barnes stares at Devon with something approaching awe. Child, you've been conducting a civil rights investigation like a seasoned attorney. My father taught me that change requires evidence, not just complaints. Devon replies simply. Jonathan addresses Patricia Hawkins directly, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority as her ultimate employer. Ms. Hawkins, you now understand that this isn't a customer service complaint. This is a federal civil rights investigation with documented evidence of systematic discrimination by Atlantic Airlines employees. Hawkins struggles to formulate a response that might salvage her career and her company's reputation. Mr. Carter, we had no idea. If we had known, if you had known what Jonathan interrupts. If you had known my son was the son of your company's owner, Ms. Hawkins, the problem isn't that you didn't know who Devon was. The problem is that it shouldn't matter who he is. Rachel Kim steps forward with legal documents. Ms. Hawkins, you're being served with notice of federal civil rights violation proceedings against Atlantic Airlines, Sarah Mitchell individually, and any supervisory personnel who failed to prevent this systematic discrimination. The crowd watches in fascination as one of the most powerful executives in commercial aviation is served with legal papers in the middle of an airport terminal. David Cross consults his tablet. The story is already trending on every major social media platform. #JusticeForDevon has over 500,000 posts in the past 2 hours. Major news networks are requesting interviews. Devon tugs on his father's sleeve. Dad, What about Miss Mitchell? Is she still on the plane? Jonathan checks his phone. According to Captain Rodriguez, she's been suspended and is being escorted off the aircraft by airline security. As if summoned by their conversation, Sarah Mitchell appears in the terminal corridor, flanked by 2 Atlantic Airlines security officers. She's clearly been crying. Her professional demeanor completely shattered her career in ruins. When she sees the crowd gathered around Gate 12, her steps slow. When she recognizes Devon and Jonathan at the center of the group, she stops entirely. "Oh my God," she whispers loud enough for everyone to hear. He's exactly who he told you he was." Jonathan says, his voice carrying across the space between them. "The son of James Carter. You just never bothered to find out who James Carter is." Sarah stares at them in horror as the full magnitude of her mistake becomes clear. She discriminated against a child, recorded herself doing it, and then doubled down on her prejudice in front of witnesses, all while targeting the son of the man who owns her airline. "Mr. Carter," she says desperately, her voice breaking. "I didn't know. I never would have, if I had realized." Jonathan's response is swift and devastating. "Ms. Mitchell, you're proving my point. You're not sorry about what you did. You're sorry about who you did it to." Devon steps forward, and when he speaks, his voice carries no anger or vindictiveness, only the profound sadness of someone who has been wounded by adult cruelty. "Miss Mitchell, you told me today that I needed to learn my place. I want you to know that I learned something important from our interaction." Sarah waits, perhaps hoping for forgiveness or understanding. "I learned that dignity isn't something people give you or take away from you. It's something you choose to keep, no matter how others try to treat you." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. Several people in the crowd wipe away tears at the 11-year-old's grace under pressure. Devon continues, "I also learned that when people reveal their true character, they teach everyone around them who they really are. Thank you for that lesson." Sarah breaks down, completely sobbing, as the weight of her actions and their consequences crashes down on her. Security Chief Maria Santos approaches Jonathan. "Mr. Carter, we've completed our preliminary investigation. Ms. Mitchell has been terminated from Atlantic Airlines effective immediately. Captain Rodriguez has filed a report documenting multiple policy violations and civil rights infractions." Jonathan nods curtly. "I appreciate your efficiency, Chief Santos. However, termination is just the beginning of the accountability process." Rachel Kim addresses the growing crowd of media representatives. "Mr. Carter will be holding a press conference in 1 hour to address the systematic discrimination his son documented across Atlantic Airlines network. We'll also be announcing the formation of the Devon Carter Foundation for Transportation Equality." As the crowd begins to disperse, preparing for the formal press conference, Devon looks up at his father. "Dad, what happens next?" Jonathan kneels down to his son's eye level, speaking quietly, despite the public setting. "Next, we make sure that no other child ever has to experience what you went through today. We turn your courage into changes that will protect other kids. And Miss Mitchell will face the legal consequences of her actions. But more importantly, her behavior today will become a teaching tool to help other people recognize and confront their own biases." Devon nods thoughtfully. "So something good can come from something bad." "The best things often do, son. The best things often do." As father and son prepare for the press conference that will reshape the commercial aviation industry, neither of them knows that they've just launched a movement that will extend far beyond airlines, far beyond transportation, and far beyond their ability to imagine. But they're about to find out that courage, documentation, and strategic action can indeed change the world, one discriminatory system at a time. The press conference takes place in Atlantic Airlines' own terminal conference room, a space normally reserved for corporate announcements and executive meetings. The irony isn't lost on anyone present that the airline is now hosting a press conference detailing its own systematic civil rights violations. Jonathan Carter stands at the podium with the commanding presence of someone accustomed to addressing boards of directors, congressional committees, and international business leaders. Beside him, Devon sits quietly in a chair that seems too large for his 11-year-old frame, yet his composure makes him appear older than his years. The room is packed with reporters from every major news network, civil rights attorneys, airline industry analysts, and federal investigators who arrived within hours of the story breaking on social media. Camera flashes pop constantly as the media documents what has already been declared a watershed moment in transportation equality. Ladies and gentlemen, Jonathan begins, his voice carrying the measured authority of someone who has planned for exactly this moment. 8 months ago, my son Devon and I began documenting what we suspected was systematic discrimination in commercial aviation. Today's incident aboard Atlantic Airlines Flight 447 represents the culmination of that investigation. Rachel Kim activates a large screen behind the podium, displaying a detailed presentation titled Pattern and Practice Discrimination in Commercial Aviation. Over 8 months, Devon traveled 23 different routes on Atlantic Airlines aircraft, Jonathan continues. He was subjected to discriminatory treatment on 22 of those 23 flights. The evidence we gathered reveals not isolated incidents by rogue employees, but institutional bias embedded in training policies and corporate culture. The screen displays audio waveforms, video clips, and detailed documentation from Devon's travels. Reporters scribble notes frantically as the scope of the investigation becomes clear. Devon. Jonathan says, turning to his son, "Would you like to tell them what you learned?" Devon approaches the microphone with remarkable poise for someone his age. When he speaks, his voice carries clearly through the packed conference room. "I learned that discrimination follows predictable patterns," he begins. First comes suspicion based on appearance, then excessive document verification, then questions about family background and finances, then suggestions to move to more appropriate seating. Finally, when all else fails, accusations of fraud or disruption. He pauses, looking directly at the cameras recording his words. "What happened to me today with Miss Mitchell wasn't unusual. It was the most extreme example of behavior I experienced repeatedly across Atlantic Airlines network." Reporter Sarah Chen from CNN raises her hand. "Devon, some people might say this was entrapment. You were deliberately trying to provoke discriminatory responses." Devon's answer demonstrates wisdom far beyond his years. "Ma'am, I never provoked anything. I simply existed as a black child in first class and documented how adults chose to respond to my presence. If my existence provokes discrimination, the problem isn't with my existence." The room erupts in murmurs of approval and scattered applause. Federal Prosecutor Maria Rodriguez steps to the microphone. "The Department of Justice has reviewed the evidence presented by Mr. Carter and his son. We will be opening a formal investigation into civil rights violations by Atlantic Airlines under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act." Patricia Hawkins, who has been sitting in the back of the room, looking increasingly pale throughout the presentation, raises her hand. "Mr. Carter, Atlantic Airlines is prepared to cooperate fully with any investigation and implement immediate reforms." Ms. Hawkins' Jonathan interrupts. "Cooperation and reform are expected, not negotiated. You don't get credit for addressing discrimination after you've been caught practicing it systematically for years." Rachel Kim advances the presentation to a slide titled Immediate Consequences. The list is extensive and devastating. Federal civil rights investigation launched $67 million in potential fines and damages. Congressional hearings on airline discrimination scheduled. Atlantic Airlines stock price down 23% in after-hours trading. Customer boycotts, spreading across social media. International media coverage, damaging brand reputation globally. David Cross addresses the media directly. The video of today's incident has been viewed over 15 million times across all platforms. The hashtag Justice for Devon has generated over 2 million posts. Major corporate customers are suspending travel contracts with Atlantic Airlines, pending resolution of these civil rights violations. Dr. Patterson, the federal judge, who witnessed Devon's treatment firsthand, approaches the microphone. I want the media and the public to understand something about what I observed today. This child conducted himself with more dignity and wisdom than most adults I see in my courtroom. The contrast between his grace and the airline employee's prejudice was so stark that it revealed the true nature of institutional discrimination. Professor Barnes joins him at the microphone. As an educator who spent 40 years working with young people, I can tell you that Devon Carter is an exceptional individual. But more importantly, every child deserves to be treated with the respect and dignity he was denied today. Marcus Webb, whose viral video started the social media explosion, addresses the crowd. I've been traveling for business for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like what happened to this kid today. But watching him handle it with such composure and intelligence, that's the real story here. He turned discrimination into a teaching moment for the entire country. Jonathan returns to the podium for his closing statement, and his voice carries the weight of someone announcing historic change. Today marks the launch of the Devon Carter Foundation for Transportation Equality. We will provide legal representation for discrimination victims, conduct oversight of airline practices, and advocate for federal legislation strengthening passenger rights. He pauses, looking at his son with unmistakable pride. We will also be implementing new policies across all Meridian Holdings transportation investments, including Atlantic Airlines. Mandatory bias training for all customer-facing employees. Independent oversight of discrimination complaints. Financial penalties for verified bias incidents. Public reporting of all discrimination allegations and their resolution. Rachel Kim adds the legal framework. Additionally, we're filing a class action lawsuit on behalf of all passengers who experienced similar discrimination. The evidence we've gathered suggests this pattern extends far beyond Atlantic Airlines to the entire commercial aviation industry. A reporter from the Washington Post raises her hand. Mr. Carter, what do you want people to learn from your son's experience? Jonathan looks at Devon, who nods and approaches the microphone one final time. I want people to learn that dignity isn't negotiable. Devon says, his young voice carrying remarkable authority. Whether you're 11 or 71, whether you're flying first class or economy, whether you're black or white or any other race, you deserve to be treated as a human being worthy of respect. He looks directly into the cameras. But I also want people to learn that change doesn't happen by hoping things get better. Change happens when you document problems, build evidence, and force accountability. My father taught me that courage without strategy is just anger, but strategy without courage is just planning. You need both to actually change systems. The press conference concludes with thunderous applause, but the real impact extends far beyond the conference room. Within hours, the story dominates news cycles across multiple countries. Civil rights organizations announce support for the Devon Carter Foundation. Other airlines begin reviewing their own policies preemptively. Congressional leaders call for comprehensive airline discrimination reform. Meanwhile, in a small apartment across town, Sarah Mitchell sits alone, watching the press conference on television, finally understanding the full magnitude of what her prejudice has unleashed. Her phone rings constantly with calls from reporters, attorneys, and former colleagues, but she doesn't answer. Instead, she watches an 11-year-old boy demonstrate the kind of grace, wisdom, and moral courage that she failed to show in her moment of testing. And for the first time since the incident began, Sarah Mitchell starts to understand not just what she did, but who she revealed herself to be, and who she might still choose to become. The transformation has begun, but the real work of change is just getting started. The aftermath of the press conference unfolds with the speed and intensity of a major news event in the digital age. Within 6 hours of Devon Carter's appearance before the cameras, the story has transcended aviation industry news to become a cultural phenomenon that forces America to confront its ongoing struggles with institutional racism. Atlantic Airlines headquarters in downtown Chicago becomes the epicenter of corporate crisis management as executives work through the night trying to contain damage that has already spread far beyond their ability to control. CEO Jennifer Morrison, who learned about the incident while attending a board meeting in London, catches the first available flight back to the United States to oversee damage control efforts that may be too little too late. The numbers tell the story of a company in freefall stock price, down 27%, in extended trading, over $2 billion in market capitalization, wiped out in a single day. Social media sentiment analysis showing 94% negative public perception, and corporate travel contracts worth $150 million suspended pending investigation results. In the federal building downtown, prosecutor Maria Rodriguez works with a team of civil rights attorneys reviewing the evidence provided by Jonathan and Devon Carter. The documentation is comprehensive, professional, and devastating. 22 incidents of discriminatory treatment across 8 months, each one carefully recorded and legally authenticated. I've been prosecuting civil rights cases for 15 years, Rodriguez tells her team, and I've never seen evidence this systematic and well documented. This isn't a case about one bad employee. This is institutional discrimination with a paper trail. Her colleague, Assistant U.S. Attorney David Kim, reviews audio files from Devon's hidden recording equipment. The Mitchell incident is the most egregious, but there's a clear pattern across multiple crew members, multiple routes, multiple months. They're going to have a very difficult time claiming this was isolated misconduct. Meanwhile, at the Devon Carter Foundation's hastily established offices donated by a sympathetic real estate developer, who was moved by Devon's story attorney, Rachel Kim, coordinates with civil rights organizations across the country. Phone lines ring constantly, with calls from other families reporting similar experiences, media requests for interviews, and offers of support from corporations eager to distance themselves from Atlantic Airlines' discriminatory practices. We've received over 400 discrimination reports in the past 6 hours, Rachel tells Jonathan during an emergency strategy meeting. Not just from Atlantic Airlines, but from across the industry. Devon's courage has opened floodgates. Professor Barnes arrives at the foundation offices with a box of files. I've been in touch with the NAACP, the Urban League, and several education advocacy groups. They all have records of similar incidents involving children and families. This is much bigger than one airline. Marcus Webb, whose viral video now has over 50 million views across platforms, joins the meeting via video conference from his home in Seattle. The social media response is unlike anything I've ever seen. Hashtag Justice for Devon is trending in 12 countries. People are sharing their own stories of discrimination, demanding accountability, calling for boycotts. But the most significant development comes from an unexpected source. Dr. Patricia Williams, Secretary of Transportation, announces that the Department of Transportation will conduct a comprehensive review of civil rights enforcement across the entire commercial aviation industry. The evidence presented by the Carter family suggests systematic failures in civil rights protection that extend beyond a single airline, Secretary Williams announces at an emergency press conference. We will be reviewing policies, training programs, and complaint procedures across all major carriers. The announcement sends shockwaves through airline boardrooms nationwide as executives realize that Devon Carter's investigation has triggered industry-wide federal scrutiny. In a quiet moment between the chaos of media interviews and legal meetings, Devon sits with his father in the foundation offices working on homework, the same calculus problems he was solving when Sarah Mitchell first approached his seat on Flight 447. "Dad," Devon says, looking up from his textbook, "do you think Miss Mitchell understood what she was really doing?" Jonathan considers the question carefully. "Son, I think Miss Mitchell understood exactly what she was doing in the moment, asserting power over someone she perceived as powerless. What she didn't understand were the consequences of revealing her true character on such a public stage. Is she a bad person?" "Devon, that's a question Miss Mitchell is probably asking herself right now. People aren't simply good or bad. They make choices that reveal their character. Her choices today revealed prejudice, cruelty, and abuse of authority. But people can choose to grow and change if they're willing to do the hard work of examining their biases." Devon nods thoughtfully, then asks, "What about the other flight attendants who treated me badly over the past 8 months? Do they know about today?" "Son, by tomorrow morning, every airline employee in America will know about today. Some of them will be defensive, some will be angry, and some will be forced to confront their own behavior patterns for the first time." Rachel Kim joins them holding a tablet with legal documents. "Jonathan, we've been served with Atlantic Airlines response. They're requesting immediate mediation to avoid protracted litigation." "What are they offering?" "Full settlement policy changes, bias training, independent oversight, and a public apology. They want to resolve this quickly and quietly." Devon looks up from his homework. "Dad, what do you think Jonathan's response carries the weight of someone who has thought strategically about this moment for months?" "Son, quick and quiet resolution serves their interests, not the interests of justice. Real change requires public accountability, not private settlements. So we keep fighting, we keep building. The foundation, the legal cases, the federal investigation, all of it continues until discrimination in transportation becomes as unacceptable legally as it is morally." As evening falls over Chicago, the immediate consequences of Devon's courage continue rippling outward. Airport security offices across the country receive new training materials on civil rights and passenger dignity. Airline executives cancel weekend plans to attend emergency strategy meetings. Congressional staffers draft legislation strengthening passenger rights and discrimination enforcement. But perhaps the most significant consequence plays out in living rooms and family conversations nationwide, where parents use Devon Carter's story to talk with their own children about dignity, justice, and the courage required to stand up for what's right. In one such conversation, 8-year-old Maya Johnson asks her mother, "Mommy, if that happened to me, would you be as brave as Devon's daddy?" Her mother, Dr. Angela Johnson, thinks carefully before answering. "Sweetheart, Devon's father was brave because he prepared his son to document injustice and fight it strategically. But the real hero in this story is Devon, who kept his dignity and his composure when adults were treating him cruelly. That kind of courage isn't about being angry or fighting back. It's about holding onto your principles when others try to make you forget who you are." Across the country, similar conversations unfold, as Devon Carter's example forces America to confront the reality that dignity, justice, and equality require active protection rather than passive hope. Tomorrow will bring congressional hearings, federal investigations, and industry-wide reforms. But tonight, an 11-year-old boy who refused to accept discrimination as normal has already changed the conversation about civil rights, corporate accountability, and the power of documented truth to expose institutional bias. The consequences are immediate, far-reaching, and irreversible. Justice, as it turns out, doesn't require age wealth or traditional power. It requires preparation, courage, and the unshakable belief that dignity belongs to everyone. Devon Carter has provided the blueprint. Now the rest of America will decide whether to follow it. 6 weeks after the incident aboard Flight 447, the federal courthouse in Chicago hosts what legal scholars are already calling the most significant civil rights case in transportation law since the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887. The courtroom overflows with attorneys, journalists, civil rights advocates, and airline industry executives, all gathered to witness proceedings that will fundamentally reshape commercial aviation. Devon Carter, now wearing a Navy suit that makes him look older than his 11 years, sits at the plaintiff's table between his father and lead attorney Rachel Kim. Across the aisle, Atlantic Airlines has assembled a legal team of 12 attorneys led by the nation's most expensive corporate defense firm. Federal Judge Maria Elena Vasquez, a Clinton appointee with a reputation for precision and fairness, calls the proceedings to order in a voice that commands immediate attention. This case presents questions that extend far beyond the specific incidents involving the plaintiff. Judge Vasquez begins. We are here to examine whether systematic discrimination in commercial aviation constitutes a violation of federal civil rights law, and if so, what remedies are appropriate to prevent future violations. Rachel Kim rises to present opening arguments for the plaintiffs, her presentation supported by detailed evidence gathered over Devon's 8 months of investigation. Your Honor, the evidence will show that Atlantic Airlines operated a systematic pattern of discrimination, targeting minority passengers, particularly children, through policies and training that encouraged profiling based on race, age, and perceived economic status. The courtroom falls silent as Rachel activates a large screen displaying audio waveforms, video clips, and statistical analysis from Devon's documented experiences. 22 incidents across 8 months involving 17 different crew members, documented with professional-grade recording equipment and corroborated by passenger witnesses. This wasn't isolated misconduct. This was institutional bias, implemented through training, reinforced through corporate culture, and protected through complaint suppression. Atlantic Airlines lead counsel Margaret Stevens, from the prestigious firm of Worthington Hayes and Associates, presents a defense focused on individual employee actions rather than systematic company policies. Your Honor, Atlantic Airlines deeply regrets the inappropriate behavior of former employee Sarah Mitchell and other individuals who failed to meet our company's standards. However, the actions of individual employees, however regrettable, do not constitute evidence of systematic discrimination by our client. Judge Vasquez interrupts with sharp questioning. Ms. Stevens, how do you explain 22 separate incidents involving 17 different employees across 8 months? Are you suggesting this represents coincidental individual misconduct? Stevens struggles with an answer that doesn't acknowledge systematic bias while explaining the documented pattern. Your Honor, we believe these incidents reflect isolated failures in individual judgment rather than company policy. Ms. Stevens, I've reviewed the evidence. The plaintiff has recordings of crew members discussing maintaining appropriate cabin atmosphere and recognizing patterns in passenger profiles. How is this not evidence of systematic policy? The question exposes the weakness in Atlantic Airlines' defense. They cannot deny the documented evidence, but admitting systematic discrimination opens them to massive liability and federal intervention. Devon takes the witness stand with remarkable composure for someone testifying in federal court at age 11. Under Rachel Kim's questioning, he methodically describes his experiences with the precision of a trained investigator. Devon, can you describe what happened on Flight 447 when Sarah Mitchell first approached your seat? She questioned whether I belonged in first class, despite my having valid documentation. When I politely confirmed my right to the seat, she began a pattern of escalating scrutiny that I had experienced on 21 previous flights. And how did you document these interactions? Devon explains his recording equipment and methodology with technical precision that impresses even the defense attorneys. I used professional-grade audio equipment to capture conversations' high-definition video for visual documentation and real-time upload systems to preserve evidence without possibility of tampering. Atlantic Airlines cross-examination attempts to portray Devon as a sophisticated operative conducting entrapment, but the strategy backfires when Devon's responses demonstrate the innocuous nature of his actual behavior. Defense attorney Stevens asks, "Isn't it true that you were deliberately trying to provoke discriminatory responses from airline personnel?" Devon's answer is devastating in its simplicity. "Ma'am, I was trying to fly from one city to another while black. If that provokes discrimination, the problem isn't with my behavior." Professor Barnes testifies as a character witness, describing Devon's composure and dignity during the Flight 447 incident. Dr. Patterson provides judicial perspective on the civil rights violations he witnessed. Marcus Webb's viral video is entered as evidence showing Sarah Mitchell's discriminatory behavior in real time. But the most damaging testimony comes from former Atlantic Airlines employees who describe the informal training and cultural messages that encouraged passenger profiling. Lisa Martinez, a former flight attendant who resigned in protest after the Devon Carter incident, testifies under oath about internal practices. "We were told to watch for passengers who seemed out of place in premium cabins," she explains. The language was coded, but the message was clear. If someone didn't look like they belonged in first class, we should find reasons to question their legitimacy. Another former employee, James Wilson, describes how discrimination complaints were systematically dismissed or suppressed to avoid negative performance metrics. Management made it clear that too many bias complaints would reflect poorly on our customer service ratings. We learned to code discrimination complaints as misunderstandings or communication issues to protect crew members and maintain statistics. The testimony reveals systematic discrimination protected through institutional policies designed to hide rather than address bias. Atlantic Airlines calls character witnesses for terminated employees and executives who claim company policies explicitly prohibited discrimination. However, their testimony crumbles under cross-examination, revealing the gap between written policies and actual practices. Rachel Kim's closing argument systematically dismantles Atlantic Airlines' defense while highlighting the broader implications of the case. "Your Honor, this case isn't about one airline or one child. It's about whether commercial aviation will continue operating under a system that treats discrimination as acceptable collateral damage, or whether we will demand that basic human dignity be non-negotiable in public transportation." She displays a final slide showing statistical analysis of passenger complaints across the industry, revealing similar patterns at multiple airlines. The evidence shows that what Atlantic Airlines did to Devon Carter represents a systematic problem requiring systematic solutions. Individual accountability is necessary but insufficient. We need structural reforms that prevent discrimination rather than simply punishing it after the fact. Judge Vasquez's ruling, delivered after 3 days of testimony and legal arguments, is comprehensive and historically significant. The court finds that Atlantic Airlines operated a systematic pattern of discrimination in violation of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. The evidence demonstrates institutional bias implemented through training, reinforced through corporate culture, and protected through complaint suppression. The financial penalties are severe. $67 million in fines and damages, with additional penalties for systematic civil rights violations. But the structural remedies prove more significant than monetary sanctions. Atlantic Airlines must implement comprehensive bias training for all customer-facing employees. Establish independent oversight of discrimination. Complaints: create a passenger rights ombudsman position. Institute regular civil rights audits conducted by external organizations, and provide quarterly public reporting of discrimination allegations and their resolution. The ruling's broader impact extends across the commercial aviation industry, as other airlines scramble to implement similar reforms proactively rather than face federal investigation and litigation. Sarah Mitchell, who testified via video conference from a counseling center where she has been receiving treatment for racial bias, expresses genuine remorse for her actions. "I destroyed my career and hurt a child because of prejudices I didn't even realize I held," she tells the court. "Working with civil rights organizations over the past 6 weeks has forced me to confront biases that I spent 12 years denying existed. I can't undo what I did to Devon Carter, but I'm committed to ensuring other children never experience what I put him through." Judge Vasquez addresses Mitchell directly. "Ms. Mitchell, your testimony suggests genuine recognition of your harmful behavior. The court appreciates accountability, but accountability must be accompanied by meaningful change to have value." As the proceedings conclude, Devon approaches the microphone for a final statement that summarizes the case's broader significance. "Your Honor, this case was never about punishing Atlantic Airlines or Miss Mitchell specifically. It was about changing systems that allow discrimination to flourish through institutional protection and cultural acceptance." He looks directly at the cameras documenting the historic proceeding. "The real victory isn't the money or the penalties. It's the knowledge that other kids won't have to experience what I experienced, and that dignity and respect will be protected by policy rather than dependent on individual kindness." The courtroom erupts in sustained applause as Devon Carter, at 11 years old, concludes testimony that has already begun reshaping American civil rights law. Outside the courthouse, Jonathan Carter addresses the media with quiet satisfaction and continued determination. This ruling represents progress, not conclusion. The Devon Carter Foundation will continue advocating for transportation equality until discrimination becomes as unacceptable legally as it is morally. The legal proceedings that began with an 11-year-old boy's courage have produced institutional changes that will protect generations of travelers. But as Devon and Jonathan head home to prepare for the next phase of their work, they know that true equality requires ongoing vigilance rather than single victories. Justice, it turns out, is a process rather than an event, and they're committed to that process for as long as it takes. 1 year after the incident that changed everything, Devon Carter, now 12 years old and several inches taller, boards Atlantic Airlines Flight 447 for the same Chicago to Boston route, where Sarah Mitchell's prejudice first revealed itself to the world. But everything else about the experience has been transformed beyond recognition. The gate agent, Maria Santos, greets him with professional warmth that carries no undertone of suspicion or skepticism. "Good morning, Mr. Carter. Welcome back to Atlantic Airlines. We're honored to have you traveling with us today." Her smile is genuine, her manner respectful, and her treatment of Devon indistinguishable from her interaction with any other first-class passenger. The change isn't performed for cameras or media attention. Devon is traveling quietly today, without fanfare or publicity. This is simply how Atlantic Airlines now treats all passengers. As Devon settles into seat 2B, the same seat where his ordeal began, he notices the subtle but significant changes throughout the boarding process. A laminated card in the seatback pocket outlines passenger rights and discrimination reporting procedures. The safety announcement includes explicit language about Atlantic Airlines' commitment to equal treatment, regardless of race, age, or background. Most importantly, the crew interactions he observes with other passengers demonstrate consistent professionalism across racial and demographic lines. The flight attendant responsible for his section is Ashley Williams, a young black woman who was hired as part of Atlantic Airlines' diversity initiative launched in response to the Devon Carter case. Her presence represents more than symbolic change. She's part of a comprehensive effort to rebuild the airline's culture from the ground up. Mr. Carter, Ashley says, approaching his seat after takeoff, "I wanted to personally thank you for making my career possible. I was hired through the opportunity programs your case created." Devon looks up from his advanced physics textbook. He's moved beyond calculus in his academic progression. Ms. Williams, I'm grateful that something positive came from a negative experience. But you earned your position through your own qualifications. That's true. Ashley acknowledges. But without the changes, your courage forced qualified candidates like me might never have gotten fair consideration. The transformation extends far beyond hiring practices. Captain Patricia Martinez, Officer Roberto Jackson's sister, who was promoted through Atlantic Airlines' new leadership development program, makes an announcement over the intercom that would have been unthinkable during the Sarah Mitchell era. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Martinez. I want to remind all passengers that Atlantic Airlines is committed to providing equal service, regardless of race, ethnicity, age, religion, or background. Any passenger who experiences discriminatory treatment should immediately notify crew members or use the passenger rights hotline found in your seatback materials. The announcement isn't legally required, but it represents the cultural shift that Devon's case initiated across the industry. Discrimination has been transformed from an open secret that companies manage through damage control into a publicly acknowledged problem that requires active prevention. Professor Barnes, who has become a close family friend and serves on the Devon Carter Foundation board, travels in seat 3A for this anniversary flight. At 71, she has witnessed civil rights progress across multiple generations, giving her unique perspective on the significance of Devon's achievement. Devon, she says during the flight, I want you to understand something about what you accomplished. I lived through the civil rights movement of the 1960s, and I can tell you that institutional change doesn't usually happen because of one person or one incident. It happens when the right person with the right evidence appears at the right moment in history. You think this was the right moment. I think you were the right person. Your father's strategic planning, your own courage and composure, the technology that allowed comprehensive documentation, the social media environment that spread your story globally. All of it came together to create change that might not have been possible even 5 years ago. The broader industry transformation has exceeded even Jonathan Carter's ambitious expectations. The Federal Aviation Administration now requires annual civil rights training for all airline personnel. The Department of Transportation publishes quarterly discrimination reports for public review. Congressional legislation has strengthened passenger rights and created financial penalties for systematic bias. More significantly, discrimination complaints across commercial aviation have dropped by 89% industry-wide, not because fewer incidents occur, but because systematic prevention programs address bias before it can manifest in passenger mistreatment. Marcus Webb, the businessman whose viral video launched the social media firestorm, joins the flight as a documentary filmmaker. He's producing a feature-length film about the Devon Carter case and its aftermath, funded by studios eager to associate themselves with civil rights progress. Devon Marcus explains your story has inspired similar investigations in other industries. Hotels, restaurants, retail families are using your documentation methods to expose discrimination in multiple sectors. The Devon Carter Foundation has expanded beyond transportation to address systematic bias wherever it occurs. The Foundation's legal team has won discrimination cases involving housing, education, healthcare, and financial services using the investigative methodology developed for Devon's airline documentation. But the most profound changes are cultural rather than legal. Devon's demonstration that dignity and respect can be maintained while confronting institutional prejudice has become a model for civil rights advocacy in the digital age. Dr. Angela Williams, Secretary of Transportation, joins the flight to mark the anniversary and discuss ongoing reform efforts. Her presence represents the federal government's continued commitment to transportation equality. Devon, the changes your case initiated have saved the careers and dignity of countless travelers who will never experience what you experienced, Dr. Williams tells him. But more importantly, you've shown that systematic problems require systematic solutions, not just individual accountability. The flight proceeds smoothly to Boston, marked by courteous service professional interactions and the kind of routine dignity that should characterize all commercial aviation. For Devon, the absence of discrimination has allowed him to focus on what he was always trying to do, simply travel from one city to another while pursuing his education and personal development. Upon landing, Devon is met by representatives from MIT, where he has been invited to present his research on systematic discrimination documentation to graduate students in civil rights law. At 12 years old, he has become a sought-after speaker on institutional bias and strategic advocacy. But before the academic presentation, Devon makes time for a private meeting that demonstrates the personal dimension of systematic change. Sarah Mitchell waits in a small conference room at Boston Logan Airport. The woman who once humiliated an 11-year-old boy for the crime of flying, while Black has spent the past year in counseling community service and genuine examination of the prejudices that destroyed her career. She looks older, wearing the stress of public disgrace and personal reckoning. But when she speaks, her voice carries none of the defensive hostility that characterized her behavior on Flight 447. Devon, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, and I'm not asking for it, she begins. I wanted to meet with you to tell you what I've learned from the damage I caused. Devon sits across from her with the same composure he showed during their original confrontation, though now it's tempered by additional maturity and understanding. I've spent the past year working with civil rights organizations, learning about implicit bias, and trying to understand how I became someone who could treat a child the way I treated you. Sarah continues. What I learned is that prejudice isn't just individual hatred. It's systematic conditioning that most people never examine until something forces them to confront it. Miss Mitchell, I appreciate your willingness to do that examination. That's more than many people manage. Devon, I want you to know that your composure and dignity that day probably saved other children from experiencing what I put you through. When I saw the video of our interaction, I finally understood what I had become and what I needed to change. Sarah's transformation isn't complete, genuine bias. Reduction requires ongoing work rather than single revelations. But her recognition of systematic prejudice represents progress that benefits society beyond their individual interaction. I work now with airline training programs, helping them understand how discrimination actually manifests in customer service, she explains. I show your video to crews and executives, and I explain how my prejudices led me to justify treating you as less than human. It's painful, but it's necessary. Devon's response demonstrates the wisdom that has characterized his approach throughout this journey. Miss Mitchell, I'm grateful that my experience has become educational for others. That gives meaning to something that was originally just painful. As the meeting concludes, Sarah offers a final reflection that captures the broader significance of Devon's courage. You taught me that dignity isn't something people give you or take from you. It's something you choose to maintain regardless of how others behave. I lost my dignity that day by choosing prejudice over humanity. You kept yours by choosing grace over anger. Outside the airport, Devon rejoins his father for the drive to MIT. The anniversary flight has reminded them both how much has changed and how much work remains ahead. Dad, Devon asks, do you think the changes will last? Jonathan considers the question carefully. Son, systematic change lasts when it becomes institutionalized through policy training and cultural transformation. What we've accomplished creates structural protection that doesn't depend on individual goodwill. but vigilance is still required. Always. Equality isn't achieved once and maintained automatically. It requires ongoing attention, documentation, and accountability. Devon nods, understanding that his work has launched a movement rather than completed one. As they drive through Boston toward MIT, where a 12-year-old civil rights advocate will teach graduate students about strategic activism, both father and son know they've demonstrated something important. Systematic discrimination can be overcome through preparation, courage, and strategic documentation. The flight that began with humiliation has concluded with transformation. The system that once protected prejudice now prevents it. And an 11-year-old boy's refusal to accept discrimination as normal has become a blueprint for civil rights advocacy in the 21st century. The transformation is systematic, comprehensive, and irreversible. Justice, it turns out, can indeed be achieved one documented case at a time. 2 years after the incident that changed everything, Devon Carter stands before the United States House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure, testifying about the landmark legislation that will bear his name. The Devon Carter Passenger Rights Act represents the most comprehensive civil rights protection in transportation history, transforming his personal experience of discrimination into systematic protection for all travelers. At 13, Devon has grown taller and more confident, but he retains the remarkable composure that first captured national attention when he faced Sarah Mitchell's prejudice with dignity and strategic thinking. Today he addresses Congress with the same measured wisdom that has made him one of the nation's most respected young advocates for civil rights. Chairman Rodriguez, Ranking Member Thompson. Members of the committee, Devon begins his voice carrying clearly through the packed hearing room 2 years ago. I was humiliated and removed from an aircraft for the crime of flying while black. Today, we have the opportunity to ensure that no child will ever again experience systematic discrimination in commercial transportation. The Devon Carter Passenger Rights Act, passed with overwhelming bipartisan support, establishes federal standards for bias, prevention, training, creates independent oversight of discrimination, complaints, institutes financial penalties for systematic civil rights violations, and requires public reporting of discrimination allegations and their resolution. But the legislation represents only the most visible aspect of Devon's broader impact on American society. The Devon Carter Foundation has documented and addressed discrimination cases across multiple industries, using the investigative methodology developed for airline documentation to expose bias in housing, education, healthcare, and financial services. Sarah Mitchell, who has spent 2 years working with civil rights organizations and bias prevention programs, watches the hearing from the gallery. Her transformation from perpetrator to educator represents the personal dimension of systematic change, demonstrating that people can choose growth over defensiveness when confronted with their own prejudices. Professor Barnes, now serving as the Devon Carter Foundation's senior advisor, sits with Jonathan Carter in the front row of the hearing room. She has witnessed civil rights progress across multiple generations, giving her unique perspective on the historical significance of Devon's achievement. Marcus Webb's documentary about the case Dignity at 30,000 Feet has won multiple awards and become required viewing in civil rights law courses across the country. The film demonstrates how systematic discrimination can be overcome through strategic documentation and coordinated advocacy. As Devon concludes his congressional testimony, he offers a final reflection that captures the broader meaning of his journey from victim to advocate to policy changemaker. 2 years ago, I learned that dignity isn't something people give you or take from you. It's something you choose to maintain regardless of how others treat you. Today, I've learned that individual dignity can become collective protection when courage meets preparation and strategy. He looks directly at the cameras documenting this historic moment. The legislation we're considering today won't eliminate prejudice from human hearts, but it will prevent prejudice from becoming systematic discrimination in public transportation. That's how progress happens, not through changing everyone's private thoughts, but through creating public systems that protect everyone's fundamental rights. The hearing room erupts in sustained applause as Devon Carter, at 13 years old, concludes testimony that transforms his childhood trauma into legislative protection for future generations. Outside the Capitol, Jonathan Carter addresses the media with quiet pride and continued determination. Today's hearing represents progress, not conclusion. True equality requires ongoing vigilance, documentation, and advocacy. The work continues. Devon Carter's legacy isn't just the discrimination he exposed or the legislation he inspired. It's the demonstration that systematic change is possible when courage, preparation, and strategic thinking combine to transform individual injustice into collective protection. His story proves that age doesn't determine impact, that dignity can triumph over prejudice, and that one person's refusal to accept discrimination as normal can indeed change the world. The boy who was humiliated for flying while black has become the young man who made flying safer and more dignified for everyone. That transformation from victim to advocate to changemaker represents the true measure of his extraordinary achievement. Justice, dignity, and equality aren't just ideals to hope for. They're outcomes to work for, document, and build into the systems that govern how we treat each other. Devon Carter has provided the blueprint. The rest of America is following it, one systematic change at a time. Devon Carter's story shows us that real change is possible when we refuse to accept discrimination as normal. His courage at just 11 years old sparked a movement that transformed an entire industry and protected millions of travelers. But this story isn't over. Discrimination still exists in workplaces, schools, restaurants, and countless other places where people deserve dignity and respect. Devon's example teaches us that documentation, strategic thinking, and unwavering courage can overcome even the most entrenched systems of bias. If this story moved you, if Devon's bravery inspired you, if you believe that every child deserves to be treated with dignity regardless of their race, please hit that like button to show your support. Subscribe to our channel for more stories of courage overcoming injustice. And most importantly, share this video with your friends and family. Share it because these stories matter. Share it because change happens when good people refuse to stay silent. Share it because somewhere another child facing discrimination needs to know that their dignity is worth fighting for. Together, we can build a world where no child has to choose between their seat and their dignity. Together, we can make sure Devon Carter's courage wasn't just a moment of justice, but the beginning of lasting change. Like, subscribe, share, and let's keep building a better world one story at a time.